Hello, everyone. How are you all doing? Awesome. So my name is Brandon Reed, and I serve as the public historian here for the International African American Museum, or as we affectionately call it, IAM. It's a little bit easier than saying the full name. So again, I'd like to welcome you all to the museum, but also I'd like to welcome you all to the African Ancestors Memorial Garden. Now, I'm coming here from having spent the last 10 years in Nashville, Tennessee, where I worked at a different museum. And I always say that in Nashville, we party a little bit different. I had the opportunity to visit that museum and work at that museum where everything's very big, it's very loud, and I even had the opportunity to visit the National Museum of African American History and Culture in DC, and it's a very large and grandiose building. And so as I was preparing for this role, I started looking up how people were talking about the museum, how people were interpreting this story. And I saw in quite a few articles that they always described the museum itself as being quiet, intentionally quiet. And I kind of wonder that because, again, I'm coming from something that's loud. We have parties. We do things a little bit different there at a music museum in Nashville. And so I wondered why we intentionally chose to describe this space as quiet. And that is because between Walter Hood, who was our landscape architect, and P. Cobbin Free, who are our architects of the museum itself, they always wanted to make sure that in every single occurrence and every single time that we were talking about the museum, the building itself was never the main focus. The content, the focus, everything that we do, all of our efforts are around preserving, celebrating, understanding, and interpreting this sacred space. We are here at Gadsden's Wharf, which historically has been one of the most prolific points of entry for captive Africans being brought into North America. Upwards of hundreds of thousands of captive African men, women, and children would have arrived right here into North American soil. And so everything that our architect designer was doing was very intentional about how can we preserve this space. And that's why you see our Thai tribute, our Granite Wall Garden, our Stele Garden, our African Origins Garden, our Low Country Garden, our Palm Grove, our Sweetgrass Field. All of these different landmarks here in the garden are designed to be able to interpret and tell this story. That's why the museum itself is raised up on these 13-foot pillars, because we wanted to make sure that individuals who are coming into this space, beyond all the excitement of a new museum, individuals who could trace their ancestry and lineage back to this particular space, back to Gadsden's Wharf, could always come in and be in conversation with this land. It could always come in and touch this ground. And so everything that we do here at the museum is to be able to preserve and celebrate these stories and to be able to interpret these stories, but also to use the power of authentic and empathetic storytelling. Understanding that these individuals were transformed through the transatlantic slave trade into individuals, given the identity of enslaved persons. They were more than that, and they have been more than that. They had knowledge, they had skills, they had practices, they had labor systems, and so on and so forth, that they were able to transform and able to pass down those cultural memories, to pass down that knowledge from generation to generation. And so I'm happy to partner with the Charleston Literary Festival to host this session, Cotton Capital, here at the International African American Museum within our African Ancestors Memorial Garden. Our session today is Cotton Capital. Cotton Capital is an investigative journalism series published by the Guardian newspaper in the UK. It explores the revelation that the paper's founders had links to slavery through the cotton and textile industry. We're joined today with Dr. Bernard Powers, director of the College of Charleston Center for the Study of Slavery, and he's going to be leading a discussion with Maya Wolfe-Robinson, editor of Cotton Capital, Lauren Williams, deputy editor of Race and Equity at the Guardian US, Michael Allen, co-creator of the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Commission, and Gary Younge, award-winning author who you all had an opportunity to hear from a little bit earlier today. So again, as you listen to this conversation, as you go throughout today's events, as you go throughout today's session, again, remember that we are on sacred ground and that we are all part of understanding, interpreting, and carrying this knowledge forward. And so can we have a round of applause for our session today? Thank you.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction to this afternoon's session, and thank you stalwarts in the audience for braving the cold and coming to participate in what we're sure will be a very important discussion in a very important place. So let's see. We've had some very brief introductions, but let me just have each one of the members of the panel to just provide a little bit more information on yourselves, and we can start right here with Maya and just come right across. Just a little bit more information about you in the way of introduction.
Hi, And I'm sorry for those of you that don't have a blanket. Thank you for coming. I'm Maya Wolfe-Robinson. I've been a journalist at The Guardian for 13 years, and I am based in Manchester, which is our main office in the UK is now in London, but we have a small Manchester office, but it's the city that we were founded in 1821.
Good afternoon. My name is Michael Allen, and I'm a retired National Park Service employee. I'm fortunate enough to be among this esteemed panelists here today to share my life, my legacy, my experience, but also the experience of folks of Gullah persuasion as we intersect with the work and the new life that the Guardian is breathing into this relationship across the oceans.
My name's Gary Younge. If you don't recognize me, it's because I now have this on. And you all heard from me before.
Hi, everyone. I'm Lauren Williams. I have been at The Guardian for about 6 months now. I'm from Brooklyn. I'm very intense about New York. But one thing that really, really attracted me to The Guardian was this work that Maya and her colleagues started with Cotton Capital. I think it's very rare to find journalistic institutions, especially in 2023, who are invested in this work. And so I'm really happy to be here and be a part of it.
Excellent. So why don't we have Maya and Lauren talk to us about the project, place it in its proper context so that we have a full appreciation of the themes and the issues that are raised by this important set of essays that are destined, to be sure, to continue to have a wonderful and enlightening effect on all who read these essays. So Maya, if you'll begin with your perspective on the essays that comprise Cotton Capital, and just talk to us about its significance and how it came about and so on. And then we'll go to Lauren, who will provide a U.S. perspective on the project.
Sure. So the Manchester office that I'm based in, if you look out the window, there's a statue of Abraham Lincoln, normally in the rain, and normally actually surrounded by skateboarders. They've kind of taken to the square. But it's a statue that Manchester is really proud of, and on the statue is an excerpt of a letter of thanks that Abraham Lincoln wrote to the working men of Manchester. And he was thanking them for their support and solidarity during the American Civil War, when there wasn't any cotton flowing in to Manchester, when Manchester was one of the biggest processors of cotton. And so when that cotton had dried up, a lot of those cotton mill workers were facing huge economic instability. Lots of them, they didn't have any work. And yet they still voted to stand in solidarity with the North and with Lincoln. And that's a story that Manchester really likes to celebrate and is rightly proud of. But it's not the whole story. The mill workers were not supported by their bosses, who wanted them to be getting back to work and wanted the cotton to start flowing back in as soon as possible. The Guardian at the time was encouraging the mill workers to go back to work. And even though the story that the Guardian has always told about itself was kind of always also in that tradition, that tradition that Manchester likes to celebrate, of kind of being on the right side, of standing in this radical tradition of, and the Guardian has always kind of had this origin story about itself, that it was started by liberal reformists who were campaigning for better representation politically of north of England. And that's all true, but what we now know is a kind of addition to that story, a story that kind of puts that in a fuller context. And so it started post-2020, or in 2020, when in reaction to George Floyd's murder, some activists in Bristol, another city in England, pushed a statue of Edward Colston. They toppled it in the city and then rolled it down to the harbour and pushed him into the water. And that was this huge moment in the UK and sparked a whole load of conversations that kind of started as demands on the streets for why Britain should grapple with its history of slavery and put it in the context of racism now. And that was picked up in boardrooms of institutions across the country that all started wondering, hang on a sec, should we be looking a little bit more at our own history? And that was the case for The Guardian. And so The Guardian's owners, the Scott Trust, it's owned by a single company which only serves to keep The Guardian going in perpetuity. That's, you know, part of the liberal progressive tradition that The Guardian newspaper is. Decided to hire academic researchers to look properly at what these liberal reformists that started The Guardian, where exactly their money was coming from, where exactly their wealth had come from, and whether it had any links to transatlantic slavery. And they found that one of them co-owned a sugar plantation in Jamaica. His nickname was King Cotton, because he was also heavily involved in the cotton trade. And for all of the rest of them, so there was one founding editor, 11 backers who all lent him £100 at the time. And for all of the ones that they could track down information on, so that was 9 out of the 11, all of them made their money through cotton, which was not a secret. It wasn't necessarily that it wasn't known. It wasn't, that bit wasn't necessarily really hard to find out, but no one had really kind of tried to look at it through this lens and draw those dots of, well, what did that mean? And so that set this project in motion. And one of them was, how do we put this, what we found, what the academic research found, how can we put that in context for our readers? And that, along with a whole big team of colleagues, that ended up as Cotton Capital. And some of you have the magazine, but it's also an audio series and a video, and there's even TikTok and Instagram content as well, because we wanted to make sure that we told this story in many different ways to as many different people as we could reach. And yeah, I'll stop there. But that was the genesis of the project, and the genesis of the project was thinking about the stories that we've always told ourselves and what bits of those stories we miss out.
I've heard Maya tell this story multiple times, and I'm always.
I'm sorry.
No. I'm just always in awe of an institution kind of going beyond the surfacing of the information and trying to figure out ways to repair and atone. And one thing you just said about putting things in context for our readers, I think springing off of the foundational work that Maya's done in the UK, I think the opportunity for us in the US is to continue to contextualize that work and to bridge the gap between where people think slavery is and where they are, because it's not a huge gap. And I think if we can connect the legacies of enslavement to people's everyday lives, I think that is a really powerful way to continue this journalism. I think even if we're doing stories about agriculture or health or education or culture, pop culture even, always making sure the stories that we do in the U.S. have this through line and disabuse us of the notion that this is something that's only contextualized within the past 10 years or the past 20 years. I think that we were talking in the green room about the success of 1619, and I think what really worked with that project was that you saw how the music you listen to today had roots in enslaved people's customs. You know how Wall Street had roots in slavery, and so I think like I said, like bridging that gap and helping people understand how the way we live today has been uniquely influenced by this institution, I think is a way to sort of really just continue the work that Maya started.
And certainly, after having read the essays and listened to you all's brief remarks so far, it's clear that the institution of slavery and its legacy is far wider in terms of its impact, its influence, and Maya, as you said, the story has not yet been completely told. And there's a lot more research that we have to do to appreciate this institution and its legacy coming all the way down to the present. So Michael, would you talk to us about your understanding of how the project has a local impact here in South Carolina? And you're certainly one of the best people to do that, given your career, your long career as a National Park Service ranger. So the story of the cotton capital, its implications for us here in South Carolina.
We know, as Maya was talking and she continued to invoke the name cotton, I may be the only person on this panel here that actually picked cotton. And that came to me only because I grew up in rural South Carolina, and the institution that once existed in South Carolina, enslavement, still had tentacles even in my childhood, whether through segregation, whether through agriculture or other vestiges. I share that initially is that I was fortunate enough to begin a public journey, if you will, dealing with these subject matters and these questions and this connectivity nearly 43 years ago. And I found myself at a crossroad in the summer of 1980, working at a very transitional place, which also have connectivity to the story, and that's Fort Sumter. And while I was at Fort Sumter in the summer of 1980, as a youngster, still in college, I was peppered with these questions. Why are you here? And what do you, as a black man, have to do with the story of Fort Sumter? And how do you fit into this narrative of talking about the American Civil War? Hearing those questions 43 years ago, digesting those questions 43 years ago, brought me to this realization that there were two things at play. Either I was out of place, out at this historic transitional place in our American experience, or maybe the agency with which I was working for was out of touch. I did not believe that I was out of place. So ironically, those type of questions that I was peppered with 43 years ago really became the foundation of me sitting under this historic structure in 2023. Because over the next 43 years or so, the work that I've been involved with on this side of the Atlantic is to bring awareness, understanding, acknowledgement, respect to those who survived the Middle Passage, those who first stepped foot on North American soil on Sullivan's Island, and those who eventually survived Sullivan's Island for 10 days in those quarantine locations or pest houses, and were eventually brought potentially here to Gaston's Wharf, and then diffused to the north and to the south, and to bring us toward what we know today as Gullah culture. So when I received this cryptic call from Guardian employees nearly 9 months ago, I said, why me? What did I have to do with what happened in England? But as they began to unpack, unfurl, and to become naked and honest about what they were doing, why they were doing, then I saw the intersection of the work that I've been involved with for the last 40 years or so with the work that they were just beginning, because what they were doing and what I have been doing matters. That's the most important thing. And what they are doing and what I have been doing is important, because it's now bringing a piece of the puzzle that had not been spoken about. Yes, I understood in some respects the African slave trade and the transatlantic journey and the removal of thousands of Africans from the West Coast, but I perhaps didn't understand the economics that drove that engine that made this possible. So I'm grateful to be here with my esteemed family members, if I will, from the other side of the Atlantic to bring together a complete story, because at the end of the day, England needs this story. At the end of the day, America needs this story. And most especially, we here in South Carolina need this story.
Very good, very good. And as I think about one of the essays, it traces the processing plant in Manchester, where cotton was processed, to South Carolina, to low country South Carolina, to black folks, Gullah Geechee people who were right here, and they were the sources of production of that cotton. So another way of linking the local to the international story. And so, Gary, would you talk to us about your understanding of the international significance of this project and its meaning?
Yeah, I mean, Britain in particular, well, there are two things, I think. The first, and Maya alluded to it, is this self-image and how one challenges and adapts the self-image to new realities. So The Guardian understands itself as an institutionally liberal paper. It is an insult from conservatives to talk about someone as a Guardian reader. That is, seriously, in Parliament, typical Guardian reader. And so to then have to grapple with its engagement with slavery helps us to understand an institution like slavery and a phenomenon like racism as not just being about bad and uncouth people, but about a system which infects and affects everybody and everything. So liberalism is infected with it. That a town like Manchester, a city like Manchester, which for all of the ways in which it was liberal, was infected and affected by it. The reason why they could make the stand that they did is because they were part of that system. I worked at The Guardian for nearly 3 decades, and in a sense, and this comes to the second point, it had never occurred to me. And in a sense, I kind of always assumed that, well, the money would have come from somewhere, and if it came in the 19th century, it wouldn't have been from somewhere good, you know, and so I didn't know that it was specifically that. But what's interesting about that is this trick that particularly in Europe can be played as a result of geography, and why this is so important. Because the trick is that most of Britain's most egregious racist stuff happened somewhere else. It happened in the Caribbean, it happened in Africa, or it happened in India, or it happened. Our civil rights movement happened somewhere else. Our civil rights leaders were primarily Gandhi and Nkrumah. These were fighting racism under the Brits. And so there is this distance which allows for what I would call an implausible deniability. That like, well, you know, if we couldn't see it, then maybe we didn't do it. But we did it. And so this moment of journalism and what is produced from that moment of journalism allows for a connection to what we should think of as kind of an early stage of globalization. We think of globalization as being something new and, you know, web-based and so on. But slavery was a form of globalization. And these international networks that were set up. And so we are very much, even as we leave the European Union and go on our own and become, this kind of, Brexit island, that we have this connection that is now forged that brings us here and to Jamaica and to parts of Africa, and to understand ourselves as being intimately connected with a range of other places in a way that we hadn't imagined previously, but that once it's pointed out, it kind of feels obvious. That once the project got going, I thought, well, of course, Manchester, cotton. It only took 2 words to kind of establish that connection, but somehow the connection wasn't made, and it's in the absence of those connections that we can have this forgetfulness, and it's in the establishing of these connections that we can remind people in a productive way.
And just to piggyback off of that, I felt that also as an American, as far as I can trace back, my family's been here for 5 generations, and Maya and I yesterday went to McLeod Plantation on James Island, and they had cotton there, and the tour guide allowed us to take some off, and she talked about how much cotton you had to pick in a day. What the weight had to be. And I was just like, okay, with or without the seeds? Because, the seeds make it heavy. She's like, no, after they took the seeds out. And so even, the disconnect of that labor and sort of, if blood stained it, then then there were consequences. And connecting that to a cotton shirt, a material that is such a part of our everyday lives that we don't think twice about. Even as an American, it felt really powerful, and it helped close a sort of, there was a dissonance there, and it helped close a sort of cognitive gap. Like this is what it took. So I think that even happens among Americans.
Sure.
And just to, sorry,
No,
you're not going to be able to stop us now. But yeah, just to kind of piggyback off that, what was really interesting is that a lot of people in Manchester knew that its nickname was Cottonopolis. There is a cotton bud fountain in St. Anne's Square in the middle of Manchester. But if you asked people, where did you think the cotton was coming from? Or I went into a Japanese small plates restaurant that is called Cottonopolis and asked them, like, oh, why have you chosen this name? They were like, oh, I think this building maybe used to be some kind of warehouse. And I was like, yeah, and people really, it took a lot, and lots of people just did not think. Cotton does not grow in the UK. We don't have that kind of climate. Well, today we do. This is very UK. But and then what's interesting is when kind of talking to people here, and then realizing that people weren't necessarily thinking, well, where did the cotton go? And so just being able to kind of close that gap through storytelling, through conversations, feels as an important part of the work.
And I think to all what's been said here, you have to look at things systematically. We here in America, those who pick cotton, manufacture it, grew it, ship it abroad, once it left the shores, that was the end of the story. Once it arrived on your shores, that was the beginning of a story. But no one talked about what was in the middle. The cross-pollination of one continent to another, the dependency of one continent to another, because in order to have that conversation, now you have to talk about your sins. And we're sitting here today talking about sins of the past. And so I think that's another benchmark, if you will, of what The Guardian is doing, is really opening up our minds and our heart and our spirit as to what really happened. And I think and I would say this to you, Maya, it came at a time, at least from this side of the Atlantic, when we have forces in our nation that would have us not to believe anything ever happened. And so now we have to wrestle with that type of attitude that would move to a race history, but yet you were bringing things that were hidden in plain view in a public arena so we can sit in the cold and have a conversation about it. And yes, it did happen.
That's right. That's right. That's right. So let's just back up just a little bit in order to come forward. So Maya, you started off talking about, and Gary, you've touched on this also, the perception that the British have of their history and connection to slavery and race. And the emphasis in Manchester has been on freedom, abolition, emancipation, the Lincoln statue, Anglo-American cooperation in the project of freedom. And so the British are among, not the first, but among the first to end the transatlantic slave trade. And then slavery is abolished in the British Empire generally in the 1830s. And those are critically important points in history that are emphasized and celebrated in the UK. But just as Michael said, once the cotton comes to Manchester, that opens up a whole new chapter, which continues after the abolition of the Atlantic slave trade, the abolition of slavery in the British Empire. This is a new phase, an international phase linking the U.S. and Great Britain and indeed the rest of the world into which cotton is exported. But most Brits have never really focused on that because, Gary, as you said, the enslaved people are in another place. They don't see them. But this is a critically important phase of world history. And Eric Williams discusses this, capitalism and slavery. Manchester, one of the early industrial cities in the world. And that industrialization is in part made possible through the enslavement of people across the Atlantic. And the process had started even earlier with the connection to the West Indies. But this emphasis on freedom and the celebration of emancipation, those are the aspects of those elements that tend to be celebrated in places like Manchester and indeed throughout the UK. So let me ask this question. So we've seen the 1619 Project in the U.S., and the 1619 Project was, and it is, designed to create a new way of thinking about American history, placing race and slavery and the legacy of slavery at the center of the story. And so Cotton Capital places enslavement at the center of the story of the rise and development and expansion, modernization of the UK in the 19th century. So what's been the reception of the project, particularly in light of what Michael said, in terms of a lot of conservative thinking in the U.S. about the teaching of race and racism and slavery-related issues. So has the UK demonstrated a readiness to receive the lessons imparted by Cotton Capital, and to integrate that particularly into the curriculum of the public school. So what's been the reaction?
So the reaction, which we knew was always going to be the reaction from, for example, most of the rest of the press, and we knew the way that they would react, and we kind of decided that we didn't care. So as Gary kind of alluded to, The Guardian is a kind of, often a kind of the butt of jokes, this byword for muesli eating, sandal wearing, liberal. And so whilst most of the press, generally their view towards any attempt to have a conversation about this history or the Black Lives Matter protests were, why are you talking about this? These are extremists. No one cares about this history. It was all in the past. Why are you trying to make us all feel guilty? I think when we published our project, they kind of didn't know where to go with it, because part of them wanted to be like, ha! You hypocrites, you liberal hypocrites, you've done this terrible thing in your history, and that proves you all to be kind of hypocrites. But then they also were like, oh, but we also don't think it's a big deal. So we don't know what to do. But anyway, that was fairly predictable. I think the response from the people that we did care about, which was the descendant communities, our black readers, well, all of our readers, but in particular black audiences, was generally, so far, positive. I think that we weren't sure how generally readers might react. We have a membership model, which means that we don't have a paywall. We want The Guardian to be free and accessible to all, so we ask for voluntary contributions. And people who are Guardian readers often kind of feel it quite strongly in their identity, as part of their identity. So we did kind of think, if we're kind of messing with The Guardian's origin story, if we're messing with what The Guardian is a byword for, because we're introducing this brutal, horrible history into that mix, into that story, is that, how is that going to land with people? But I think on the whole, the readers that wrote to us were really interested. They were really glad. Some of them said about, this is the history that we weren't taught at school. Others were like, we've been trying to talk about this history for years, and we're so glad that you're doing it. And, so on the whole, I would say, from the people that we care about, positive.
Very, very good, very good, very good. There's just continuing this theme of making the origin story of the Guardian more complex. The Guardian looks at the situation in Britain, and also looks at the slavery situation in the U.S. And with regard to the coming of the American Civil War and the events that contribute to that, the Guardian editors have a certain perception of abolitionists in America. When the war happens, they have a certain perception of the union's goals and objectives, and the knowledge of what the Guardian editors are saying further complicates this notion of the liberal status of the Guardian. Can you all, whoever wants to make a contribution to that, just talk about that, the kind of ambivalence. At best, it's an ambivalence that the Guardian editors have toward the North during the Civil War, the abolitionists, the American abolitionists. The Guardian editors, they favored the end of slavery in the UK, but that came about in a certain way, right? That came about with, one, compensation, and two, apprenticeship. In other words, emancipation, and then 4 additional years in which the formerly enslaved people had to continue working for the people that owned them until they could literally become free. And the Guardian in the 30s said, well, that was justice for both sides. That was justice for both sides. And then you jump ahead 20 years, the eve of the American Civil War. The editors have a certain perception of the American abolitionists, and then when the war happens, a certain perception of the Union side, as well as a certain conception of the Confederate side. So let's just talk about that a little bit.
I mean, some of that, I think, speaks to a classical challenge of how we understand liberalism, that liberalism should not be confused with radicalism. Sometimes it can be radical, depending on the positionality of other things, and it certainly, there are radical elements within liberalism, but liberalism itself can often capitulate to more dominant forces. There were many, JFK was a liberal, and yet when we look at some of his equivocal and ambivalent positions through the early civil rights era, we see that he wasn't always, exactly on the right side, or he was waiting to see which way the wind would blow. And so it speaks to, in a sense, it speaks to its tradition. I mean, its ambivalence is consistent, if you like. The one other thing I would say, though, which comes back to Maya's point about how it's received, is that, and I'd left The Guardian by this point, and I no longer work full-time for The Guardian. I'm a full-time academic. So I'm not on the payroll, and I can say this, that it means it's taking itself seriously. It's taking issues of race, it's taking its history seriously, even if it's difficult, even if it complicates the origin story, even if it may interrupt a kind of certain trajectory it has, that it's taking itself seriously. And one of the reasons I think why other newspapers with different traditions found that tricky is because they don't take it seriously, because they're quite opportunistic about it. And so when things get interesting and things get tough, I think, particularly when it comes to addressing things that have been done but not acknowledged, is when you say, yeah, we did that. We did that. And now we have to deal with the fact that we did that. Which is a conversation that I wish, and now I'm just going to speak for Britain, that Britain had more often. Not why are you bringing up old stuff, which is their attitude to the bits of its history that they don't like, but yeah, we did that. And that in the process of saying that, you get to look, Mancunian, Manchester people, they did this and they did this, which was good, and then they did this and they did this, which was bad. That this is a complicated story. And it's a story not about bad people or good people, but a system that was bad in which people had to find their way, and it affected and infected all of us. And it's quite painful as a Briton to see how readily and kind of desperately those conversations are avoided.
I think where we're going now is how do we reconcile ourselves with the past? Unfortunately, there have been impediments that have been put in our pathway that make that reconciliation difficult. First of all, the whole aspect of denying our culpability in the sin, in the situation, in the circumstance. So when you have the guardian willing to step over or beyond the impediments and to really come clean, but you have a society or segment of your population that they are not ready to step into what you're bringing up, that's where the conflict comes in. You know, I take here, you know, we still have questions, even in our American experience today, about the whole validity of slavery and whether or not it existed in the manner that it did. Some folks saying now it was a benefit for those who were in it, and everything else in between. And so when the water is diluted with such conversation, it takes away the strength of what needs to be discussed. So, not living in England, I'm assuming that your readership of The Guardian had to find a way to step beyond the impediments. And often that impediment, at least I know here in America, comes through our educational system. Because a lot of time that's at the first line of what we know, what we don't know, what we've been told by the teacher, because that's what they want us to know, and often that's far from the truth. So I think as we look to your question, Dr. Powers, we have to first remove the impediment, be open and honest about the situation or the circumstance, and as Maya has done and others have done, be willing to go it alone if necessary in order to bring a point. This very building that we're in here today came from the singular mind in many respects of former Mayor Joe Riley. Now, being an original board member, sitting in the first board meeting for this institution 23 years ago, we realized that we were challenged by this concept that brought us together to have a conversation about building this 23 years ago. And then over the course of the 23 years, the headwinds that we had to endure and had to go through, the challenges, the naysayers then, and some even now, that we have to still overcome. It's what the Guardian is walking through. But I would encourage you, Maya, and others of your staff that see the light, continue to look toward it and move in that direction.
I think an opportunity too on that point that we have with the Guardian US is that we're only 12 years old here. I think we kind of have like an image hurdle too. A lot of people think we're Guardian Health, like that's the sort of American connotation. But there isn't that sort of preciousness and attachment to an institution that wouldn't allow these kinds of conversations to happen. I was just at NABJ, the National Association of Black Journalists annual conference in August, and so many journalists kept coming up to the table speaking specifically about Cotton Capital and how they were so excited that it existed. You know, there's a real hunger for this kind of work, and I think because Guardian US is so young, in America, we're uniquely positioned to sort of stay down that road.
Let me ask another local type of a question, and particularly for Gary and Maya. So one of the authors of the essays in Cotton Capital, Dr. Michael Taylor, says that knowing how the construction of some of the grand buildings in Manchester were financed is important because they were built with the profits from slavery, both American slavery and British slavery. And quoting him, he says, Manchester would not look the way it does or be the way it is today without those slavery connections. And so my question is, can you see that in the landscape? Can you see the evidence of the presence of enslaved people, their labor, their products in the cityscape, in the architecture of Manchester? And I asked the question because I took a Black History tour of Liverpool many years ago. And we culminated the tour at a bank. And the guide says, now, before we enter the bank, I want you to look at the reliefs on the side of the doorway. And so when we walked up to the door of this bank, we saw these reliefs on each side of Africans with chains on their legs, indicating obviously where the capital from that bank originated and how it originated. Now there's no scene like that. There's no relief, no image like that in Charleston. Although we could have many of them right here in Charleston, and we ought to. But that's what I'm talking about. As you look around Manchester, is there evidence in the landscape, in the cityscape, in the architecture that goes back and reveals the presence of Africans, their linkage in any way to the city?
Yeah, and one thing that was interesting about doing this work is that I just was walking around the city that I lived in with just completely different eyes. And so because Manchester has not had, doesn't have a relationship with this history where it's made explicit, though it's not made explicit, there aren't kind of, plaques or explanatory signs, but once you know, you see it all the more. Yes. And so one example is that there are kind of two symbols of Manchester, and one is the bee, the worker bee, which is everywhere, and the origins of that was representing the labor of people that worked processing cotton in the mills and in the factories. And that symbol, particularly in recent years, has become this real symbol of togetherness, of collective solidarity, of particularly after Manchester suffered a terrorist attack, and people have bee tattoos. The bees are all over the bins. The bees are everywhere. But the other symbol, the ship, which was the official symbol of Manchester, and it was to represent the cotton industry. It was representing the ships that went laden with, went back and forth and came back laden with raw cotton and then shipped the processed cotton. And that symbol is still on the crest of the two main football teams, Manchester City and Manchester United. And I hadn't made that connection before. Like I knew the symbol, I knew what the kind of, I could point to them, but I hadn't realized what the ship actually meant. And it's things like that where I now, when I'm walking around, I count the bees and I count the ships and how much more prominent the bees are, but now I'm looking for them, I see the ships.
I would only add, if one goes beyond Manchester, there's a range of things where really echoing Maya's point, where it's once you think about it and once you know, then you can't not think about it. So our national drink is tea. We don't grow tea in England. That's grown in India. What do we put in the tea? Well, we put sugar in the tea. We don't grow sugar in England. We grow that in the Caribbean. Our soccer team has 3 lions on its shirt. We don't have lions in England. The lions are from somewhere else. So if we look at Jane Eyre, and who's in the attic in Jane Eyre, is Bertha from Jamaica. If you watch the original Mary Poppins, when the man starts shooting at the Hottentots, that it's everywhere once you start looking and once you start knowing where to look. And it's nowhere if you choose not to see it.
Excellent point. And Gary, I think we're going to end this section on another one of your observations, and then we're going to go to questions. And let me see if I can just find, yes. And that's a point that you make in your writing about forgetting and remembering. And you reflect on British history and culture and civilization, and you say that with regard to Britain and issues of race and slavery, it's not a matter of forgetting, because for many Britons, they made a conscious, deliberate effort to disregard this element of their past. And so it's not forgetting, because you say that you can't really forget what you refuse to know. What you refuse to know. And unfortunately, there's an effort, and Michael referred to this a few moments ago, abroad, certainly here in the U.S., to prevent young people in public schools from knowing, a conscious effort being mounted. Let's just keep that in mind.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to be super brief. This is the last session of Charleston Literary Festival 2023, and I just want to say it's an absolute honor to close out our session with a panel on transatlantic slave trade and the implications of systemic racism. It's also really important to us in what we do at Charleston Literary Festival to host sessions like this that speak in opposition to denial or gleeful or willful not knowing. So thank you again to our panelists, Lauren L. Williams, Gary Younge, Dr. Bernie Powers, Michael Allen, and Maya Wolfe-Robinson. Thank you all for attending Charleston Literary Festival this year, and thank you so much for sharing with us.